It was late in the evening, the kind of night when the streets were quiet and only the faint hum of passing cars filled the air. A man named Daniel was driving home after a long day at work. He worked as an FBI agent, but tonight he wasn't wearing a suit or badge. He had on a simple gray hoodie and jeans, just another man behind the wheel of a dark sedan, tired and ready to get home. The air was cool, and his favorite old jazz song was playing softly from the car speakers. He tapped his fingers on the steering wheel, lost in thought. It had been a rough week of long hours and endless paperwork. All he wanted was a warm shower, a quick meal, and a few hours of sleep before another early morning. As he drove through a quiet neighborhood, he noticed a police car parked near a gas station. He didn't think much of it. He had passed dozens of officers during his years working with local departments. He respected their job. In fact, he had worked side by side with some of them on important cases. But this night would be different. A few blocks later, Daniel saw bright flashing lights in his rearview mirror. At first he thought maybe the officers were heading somewhere else. But when the lights stayed behind him and the siren gave a short, sharp burst, he realized they were pulling him over. He slowed down and parked on the side of the empty road. Daniel took a slow breath. He wasn't speeding and his license and insurance were valid. He reached for the glove compartment to get his papers ready, just like he had done many times before. He rolled down his window halfway and waited. 2 officers stepped out of the patrol car. Their flashlights beamed directly into his face, blinding him for a moment. One of them, tall and heavy-set, walked up quickly and said, "License and registration." His tone wasn't polite. It sounded more like an order than a request. Daniel calmly handed over his documents. "Sure, officer," he said quietly. The second officer stood a few feet behind, hand resting on his holster, eyes sharp and suspicious. Daniel could feel the tension immediately. Something about their body language told him this stop wasn't just about a routine check. "What's the problem, officer?" Daniel asked, trying to keep his voice calm. "You tell me," the taller one replied. "We got a report of a car matching this description involved in suspicious activity." Daniel frowned slightly. "Suspicious activity? I'm just driving home from work." The officer didn't answer. He looked at the ID in his hand, then back at Daniel, his eyes narrowing. "This your car?" "Yes," Daniel said. "It's registered in my name." "You can check." The officer chuckled under his breath. "We'll see about that." The second officer circled around the car, shining his flashlight inside. He asked questions that didn't make sense. Where Daniel was coming from, why he was in this neighborhood, and why he was driving such a nice car. It was clear from their tone that they had already decided something about him before even looking at the facts. Daniel knew that arguing wouldn't help. He had been trained to stay calm under pressure, to read behavior, to stay alert. But being on the other side of the badge was a different kind of test. "Step out of the car," the taller officer ordered. Daniel hesitated for a second, then nodded. "All right, I'm stepping out," he said slowly. He kept his hands visible and moved carefully. He knew how quickly situations like this could spiral out of control. As soon as he stepped out, the air around them seemed heavier. The flashing lights reflected off the dark paint of his car. The street was empty except for them. "Turn around," the officer said. "Put your hands where I can see them." Daniel sighed quietly but did as told. "I don't understand what this is about," he said. "Like I said," the officer replied sharply, "your car matches a description. You're being detained for questioning." The word detained hit him harder than expected. He had used it hundreds of times in his own career, but hearing it directed at him, without reason, was something else. He turned his head slightly, trying to speak calmly. "Officer, I work for the federal government." "Save it," the man interrupted. "We've heard every story in the book." The other officer laughed quietly, shaking his head. "Yeah, they all say that." Daniel closed his eyes for a second. He could feel his heartbeat getting stronger, but he didn't let anger show. He had learned long ago that keeping control of his emotions was his greatest strength. "Can I ask that you not touch my car?" he said as one officer started peeking inside. "We'll touch what we need to," the man replied. "You don't get to tell us what to do." Inside the car on the passenger seat was Daniel's briefcase. It contained his FBI badge, identification, and confidential documents. Seeing the officer reach toward it made him tense up. "Please don't open that," Daniel said firmly. The taller officer smirked. "What's in there? Something you don't want us to see?" Daniel took a small breath. It's government property. I'm asking you to be careful." The officer looked at him for a moment, his face half hidden in the glow of the flashlight. "You think you're above the law, huh?" he said. "You think we're supposed to believe you're some kind of agent? Dressed like that?" Daniel didn't respond. He knew anything he said would only make things worse. For a few minutes they whispered to each other, pretending to check his ID, but he could tell they weren't calling anything in. They were stalling, maybe trying to intimidate him. The power in their hands was obvious, and they enjoyed using it. The longer it went on, the more surreal it felt. Daniel had arrested dangerous criminals, interrogated suspects, and trained new agents on how to de-escalate tense situations. But now he was standing under flashing lights, being treated like a suspect for no reason other than their assumptions. Finally, the second officer returned from the patrol car and said, "Dispatch doesn't show anything. This ID could be fake." Daniel looked at him calmly. "It's not fake." "Yeah, well, we'll see about that," the officer replied, stepping closer. "You got any drugs or weapons on you?" "No." "You sure about that?" Daniel's patience was thinning, but he stayed composed. "Yes, I'm sure." The taller officer walked toward him and said, "If you don't want us to search your car, maybe you've got something to hide." "I don't have anything to hide," Daniel said quietly. "I just don't want you going through federal property without a warrant." That statement seemed to irritate them even more. One of them muttered under his breath, "Guy thinks he's a lawyer now." A car passed by slowly, its driver staring curiously at the scene before disappearing down the road. The flashing lights continued to paint the street in red and blue. Inside, Daniel's mind was working fast. He wasn't afraid for himself. He knew how to handle tense moments, but he was angry at what this represented. These were the people who were supposed to serve and protect. Yet they were letting their biases lead their actions. He thought about all the training sessions he had led for law enforcement officers across different states. He had spoken about trust, fairness, and professionalism. He had always believed that change was possible. But at that moment, watching two officers treat him like a criminal without reason, he realized how deep the problem went. Minutes passed. The officers talked in low voices near their patrol car. Daniel stood still beside his own, hands visible, face calm, but his thoughts racing. He considered showing his badge to end this instantly, but a part of him wanted to see how far they would go. When he finally spoke again, his tone was measured. "Officers, I suggest you call your supervisor. You're making a serious mistake." That seemed to catch them off guard. "Oh yeah?" the taller one said. "And why's that?" "Because," Daniel said, looking him straight in the eyes, "you're about to realize who I am." The officers exchanged puzzled glances. The taller one laughed nervously. "Yeah, sure. Go ahead, tell us. Who are you supposed to be?" Daniel didn't raise his voice. "I'm a federal agent. I work with the FBI." They stared at him for a second, then both burst out laughing. "You?" one said mockingly. "Right, and I'm the president." Daniel stayed silent. He didn't try to prove himself. He just waited. The silence stretched and the laughter faded. Something about his calmness made them uneasy. "All right," the taller one finally said. "We'll call the supervisor. But if this is some kind of lie, you're in big trouble." Daniel nodded once. "Call him." As they stepped back toward their patrol car to make the call, Daniel stood there in the quiet night, the cool breeze brushing against his face. For a moment he looked up at the sky. He had seen many kinds of injustice in his career, but nothing hit closer to home than this. He didn't know it yet, but what would happen next would change more than just his night. It would change an entire department's way of thinking. And it was only the beginning. The two officers stood by their patrol car talking quietly while Daniel waited beside his vehicle. The red and blue lights kept flashing across the road, cutting through the darkness like restless fire. Daniel folded his arms and watched them. He didn't say a word, but his calmness made them uneasy. One of the officers finally picked up the radio. Daniel could hear bits and pieces of their conversation. They were requesting their supervisor to come to the location, saying they had a possible suspect with questionable ID. The words made Daniel shake his head slightly. Even now they refused to believe the truth that was right in front of them. The air was cool, but Daniel felt the heat rising inside him. Not from fear, but from quiet frustration. He had worked too hard, built too much, and sacrificed too many nights to be treated like a liar by people who hadn't even taken a moment to ask questions properly. Still, he stayed patient. Years in the field had taught him that silence could be louder than any argument. The taller officer, who had been leading the stop, came back to him with a smirk. "So, Agent," he said mockingly, "where's your FBI car? Or do you just drive this thing when you're off duty?" Daniel looked at him calmly. "I was heading home. I wasn't on duty." "Right," the officer replied. "So you expect us to believe you're some kind of special agent, and yet you're just cruising around in a hoodie and an old sedan?" Daniel didn't answer. The officer shook his head and stepped closer, his flashlight shining directly into Daniel's face again. "Listen," the officer said in a low voice. "We've seen all kinds of stories out here. You're not the first guy who tries to act calm to get out of trouble. But let me tell you something. Being quiet doesn't make you innocent." Daniel looked straight into his eyes and said, "Neither does being loud make you right." The officer blinked, caught off guard by his tone. There was no anger in Daniel's voice, no fear, just quiet strength. For a second, it seemed to unsettle him, but he quickly masked it with arrogance. The second officer was still circling around Daniel's car. He stopped near the passenger side and pointed his flashlight at the briefcase again. "What's in there?" he called out. "Official documents," Daniel said. "I already told you not to touch that." The officer ignored him and reached for the door handle. The car was locked, but that didn't stop him from knocking on the window with the flashlight. "Pop the door open," he demanded. "No," Daniel replied calmly. "That's not happening without a warrant." The taller officer turned sharply. "You refusing a lawful order?" Daniel kept his tone even. "It's not a lawful order to search government property without a warrant. You know that?" The officer stepped forward again, his face hardening. "You think you know the law better than we do?" "I think I know the law well enough to recognize when someone's breaking it," Daniel said. That silence again. Heavy, sharp, tense. The two officers stared at him, their pride colliding with his calm confidence. It wasn't the kind of resistance they were used to. He wasn't shouting or begging. He wasn't afraid. He was just standing there, unmoved, certain, unshakable. Finally, the radio crackled and one of the officers spoke into it. "Yeah, he's still here. Says he's an FBI agent or something. Bring the supervisor quick." A small sigh of relief escaped Daniel's lips. The situation was about to reach a turning point. A few minutes later, another patrol car appeared at the far end of the road. Its headlights glowed faintly as it slowed down, then stopped behind the first one. The new officer who stepped out was older, calmer looking. His uniform was neater and his tone carried more authority. This was the supervisor they had called. "What's going on here?" he asked, walking toward them. The taller officer quickly began explaining, twisting the story to sound like they had acted out of caution. He mentioned suspicious behavior, unclear identification, and possible false credentials. Daniel didn't interrupt. He stood silently, his face expressionless but his eyes steady. When the supervisor turned to him and asked for his side of the story, Daniel spoke clearly and simply. "I was driving home. They pulled me over without reason. They've had my license and ID for 20 minutes now. I told them who I am, and they refused to believe me. They tried to search my car without a warrant." The supervisor frowned and looked at the officers. "Is that true?" The taller one shifted uncomfortably. "We were just making sure everything checked out. The ID looked suspicious." The supervisor raised an eyebrow. "Suspicious how?" The officer hesitated. "It looked too clean. Like it could be fake." The supervisor sighed. "Show me." He took the ID from the officer's hand and looked at it under his flashlight. His eyes lingered on the details, the watermark, the embedded code. His expression changed immediately. "This is real," he said firmly. "This man works for the Bureau." The air around them seemed to freeze. The two officers looked at each other, speechless. Daniel didn't move, didn't say a word. He just watched them. The supervisor turned to Daniel. "Sir, I apologize for this. Can I please see your badge for confirmation?" Daniel nodded. He unlocked his car, opened the door, and picked up his briefcase from the passenger seat. As he opened it, the gold badge inside glinted under the streetlight. He handed it to the supervisor. The supervisor looked at it carefully, then nodded again. "Everything checks out. He's an FBI agent." The two officers stood stiffly, their faces pale. The taller one swallowed hard, trying to come up with something to say. We didn't know. He wasn't dressed like—" "That's not an excuse," the supervisor interrupted sharply. "You don't need someone to be in a suit to treat them with respect." The words hit like a hammer. Neither of the officers spoke. Daniel stood quietly, watching the scene unfold. For a moment, no one said anything. The sound of a distant train echoed in the background. The supervisor looked at Daniel again and said, "Sir, I'm truly sorry about this." "It shouldn't have happened." Daniel gave a slow nod. "I appreciate that. But it's not just about me. It's about how quick some people are to assume." The supervisor seemed to understand. He glanced back at his officers, his disappointment clear. "We'll be talking about this back at the station." Daniel looked at the two men who had humiliated him only minutes ago. Their confidence was gone. Their faces showed regret, embarrassment, maybe even fear of the consequences that would follow. But Daniel didn't feel satisfaction. He didn't want revenge. He just felt tired. Tired of moments like this that kept happening, even after all the progress people claimed society had made. As the supervisor dismissed the situation, Daniel got back into his car. Before starting the engine, he looked at the officers one last time. "You know," he said quietly through the open window, "you could have just asked a few questions. That's all it takes sometimes, just a little respect." The taller officer didn't reply. The other one nodded slowly, his eyes down. Daniel drove off, the flashing lights fading behind him. The road ahead was dark and empty, but his mind was wide awake. The incident kept replaying in his head, the way they looked at him, the tone in their voices, the instant judgment before any facts were known. He'd seen it happen to others, but living through it himself left a different kind of mark. He thought about his training, about all the times he had spoken in seminars to local police departments about bias and fairness. He had believed in teamwork between federal and local officers. But tonight he saw how much work still needed to be done. When he finally reached home, the street was quiet. He parked, sat for a moment, and stared at his hands on the steering wheel. They were steady, but his heart was heavy. He didn't tell anyone that night what had happened. He just went inside, hung his jacket, and sat down in the silence of his living room. It wasn't fear that filled him. It was disappointment. He had always believed that integrity and truth would speak louder than prejudice. And yet, the same system he worked so hard to protect had almost turned against him because of assumptions. But Daniel was not someone who let bitterness win. He knew that every wrong moment was also a chance to create something right. He made a silent promise to himself that night. He would not let this pass unnoticed. Not because of his pride, but because it mattered. It mattered for every person who might one day face the same situation and not have the power to speak up. So as the night grew quieter, Daniel opened his laptop and began typing a report. Every detail, every word spoken, every action taken. He didn't exaggerate. He didn't change the facts. He just wrote the truth, because he believed that the truth, even if uncomfortable, was the only way forward. And as he saved the file, he didn't know yet that his simple report, that one honest record of a humiliating night, would soon shake the local department from top to bottom. It was far from over. It was only the beginning of something much bigger. The next morning, Daniel sat in his small kitchen with a cup of black coffee in front of him. The sunlight was coming through the blinds, but his thoughts were still stuck in the darkness of the night before. He hadn't slept much. The images replayed again and again, the flashing lights, the tone of their voices, the disbelief when the truth came out. He opened his laptop and reread the report he had written before bed. Every line felt heavy but necessary. It wasn't written out of anger. It was written out of duty. He wasn't the kind of man who sought revenge. He just wanted accountability. He believed in the system, even when it disappointed him. After checking the details once more, he attached the file to an internal email and sent it directly to his regional FBI office. The subject line was simple: Incident with local police department. Once he hit send, he leaned back and stared at the screen. A small part of him wondered what would happen next. He knew the Bureau took these matters seriously, but he also knew these situations were sensitive. He had worked on internal investigations before. Things like this could easily get buried under excuses or paperwork. But he just hoped that this one wouldn't. A few hours later, his phone buzzed. It was his field supervisor, a calm and fair man who had known Daniel for years. His voice on the other end sounded concerned. "I read your report," he said. "Are you okay?" "I'm fine," Daniel replied. "It's not the first time I've been treated unfairly. But it's the first time it happened in uniform silence. There was a pause. "We're opening an inquiry," his supervisor said. "This can't be ignored. You did the right thing by documenting it." Daniel thanked him and ended the call. For a moment he felt a quiet relief. Maybe this time something would change. Over the next few days, the incident began to spread quietly through official channels. The FBI had reached out to the local police department for clarification. What had started as two officers' arrogance was now turning into an official matter. At the local department, things were tense. The supervisor who had arrived at the scene that night had already filed his own report. He had described the situation truthfully, admitting that his officers had acted without reason and failed to follow proper procedure. The chief of police wasn't happy. The department had faced complaints before, but this was different. This involved a federal agent. Within a week, Daniel was invited to meet with the Internal Review Board. He arrived in a dark suit, carrying the same briefcase that had caused so much confusion that night. As he walked through the glass doors of the meeting room, everyone turned their heads slightly. Some faces showed respect, others discomfort. "Agent Daniel," the chairperson said as he entered. "Please have a seat." He sat down and quietly placed his briefcase beside him. The room smelled faintly of coffee and paper. A few people took notes while others reviewed documents in front of them. "Can you walk us through what happened in your own words?" one of the board members asked. Daniel spoke calmly, clearly, and without exaggeration. He described the stop, the officers' behavior, their refusal to verify his ID, and how they had tried to search his car. He didn't raise his voice or dramatize the story. He just told the truth detail by detail. When he finished, the room was silent for a few moments. Finally, one of the members said, "That's unacceptable behavior for any law enforcement officer, regardless of rank." Daniel nodded slightly. "It's not just about me," he said. "It's about the way they saw me before I even said a word. If that's how they treat someone they think is powerless, imagine how they treat those who truly have no voice." The words hung in the air. Even the board members who had remained expressionless before now looked uneasy. They all knew what he meant. After the meeting, Daniel stepped outside into the sunlight. The air felt lighter. He didn't know what the outcome would be, but he knew he had done what was right. 2 days later, his phone rang again. It was the same supervisor from the local department, the one who had seen the badge that night. His voice was steady but respectful. "Agent Daniel, I wanted to let you know," he said. "The 2 officers from that night have been placed on suspension pending further investigation." Daniel was quiet for a second. "Thank you for letting me know. They'll be interviewed next week," the supervisor continued. "The department's reviewing all body camera footage and dispatch logs." "That's good," Daniel said softly. "The truth will show itself." News of the suspension spread quickly through both agencies. It wasn't public yet, but whispers traveled fast. In small towns, secrets rarely stayed hidden for long. Before the end of the week, local reporters had caught wind of an incident involving an FBI agent and 2 officers. They didn't have names yet, but that didn't stop the story from gaining attention. Daniel avoided reading the news. He didn't want to fuel speculation, but he knew things were moving. A few days later, he was called back to the local station, not for questioning, but to formally close his statement. When he arrived, the atmosphere was completely different from that night. Officers greeted him with polite nods. Some avoided eye contact. Others whispered to each other quietly. The same supervisor met him at the door and shook his hand. "Thank you for coming in," he said. "And thank you for staying professional through all of this." Daniel nodded. "Professionalism is what we all should live by," he said. The 2 walked down the hallway together. Daniel noticed the quiet tension among the staff. It was clear that what had happened had left a mark. The department was going through introspection, something that rarely happened unless a mistake was too big to ignore. When they reached the conference room, the 2 officers from that night were already sitting there, waiting. They looked different now, nervous, pale, uneasy. They didn't carry the same confidence they had before. Daniel sat across from them. For a moment, no one spoke. The air was thick with unspoken things. Finally, the supervisor broke the silence. "We're here to clear the record and hear both sides officially," he said. "Agent Daniel has already submitted his statement. Gentlemen, this is your chance to explain yourselves." The taller officer looked down, tapping his fingers nervously on the table. "We made a mistake," he said quietly. "We didn't verify things properly. We misread the situation." Daniel listened carefully, his face calm but unreadable. The second officer added, "We didn't mean any harm. We were just trying to be cautious." "Cautious?" the supervisor repeated. "Cautious doesn't mean careless. You treated a federal agent like a suspect, and you violated basic procedure." The two men nodded silently. Daniel finally spoke. "I appreciate your apology," he said. "But this isn't about me. It's about how easy it was for you to assume something bad before asking a single question. That's what needs to change." Neither officer looked up. The meeting ended quietly. As Daniel left the station, several younger officers watched him pass. Some nodded with respect. One even whispered, "Sorry about what happened, sir." It was small, but it meant something. Change often began with small things. Over the next week, internal reports confirmed that both officers had violated multiple procedures. They were removed from active duty until further notice. The department announced new training sessions on bias awareness and community respect. When Daniel heard about it, he didn't feel victory. He felt a mix of sadness and hope. It shouldn't have taken humiliation for people to learn empathy, but if it made them better officers, maybe something good could still come out of it. He sat alone that evening, looking out the window as the sun went down. He thought about all the people who didn't have a badge, who couldn't prove their innocence so easily. He thought about how many stories like his never got told, how many ended without fairness. He made up his mind then. He would volunteer to lead one of the new training sessions at the local station. Not to shame anyone, but to show them what respect really looked like. He believed that people could change if they were shown the truth, not forced to it. So he made a call to his supervisor and said, "I want to help with the new program. I think my story could make a difference." His supervisor agreed immediately. "I think that's a good idea," he said. "People will listen to you." And he was right. Because what happened next would surprise everyone, including the two officers who once stood against him. It was no longer about anger or justice. It was about transformation. And Daniel was ready to lead it. The next few days were quiet, but not in a peaceful way. Daniel couldn't stop thinking about that night. The flashing lights, the harsh voices, the disbelief when they saw his badge. It all replayed in his head again and again. He had faced tense situations before, even dangerous ones during investigations, but this was different. This time, it wasn't about a criminal case. It was about his dignity. It was about being seen as less than who he was just because of how he looked. He didn't talk much about it at first. He tried to move on, pretending it was just another bad encounter. But the more he thought about it, the more it bothered him. He knew this kind of thing didn't just happen to him. It happened to others too. People who didn't have an FBI badge to protect them. The thought of that made his stomach tighten. He realized he couldn't stay silent. The next morning, Daniel gathered every detail he remembered. The time, the location, the badge numbers, the words that were said. He wrote it all down carefully. Then he called his bureau contact and filed a formal report, explaining what had happened. His tone was calm and professional, but inside he was still angry. Not the kind of anger that makes you shout, but the kind that makes you want change. When the local police department got the report, everything went into motion. An internal investigation was opened. The two officers were taken off active duty while their actions were reviewed. At first, they denied everything. They claimed Daniel had been uncooperative and suspicious, but the dashcam footage told a very different story. The video showed Daniel's calm voice, his steady hands, his clear explanation. It showed the officers' mockery, their aggressive tone, and their decision to search his car without reason. The department couldn't ignore what they saw. The truth was right there on the screen. News about the incident quietly spread through law enforcement circles. Some officers couldn't believe what had happened, while others said it didn't surprise them at all. A few even reached out privately to Daniel, saying they admired how he handled himself. They knew many people would have reacted in anger, but he hadn't. He had stood tall and let the truth speak for itself. Daniel didn't want fame or pity. What he wanted was accountability. He knew change only came when people were forced to face what they did wrong. He had seen departments protect their own before, covering up bad behavior to save reputation. But this time he wasn't going to let that happen. Weeks went by. The investigation team called Daniel in for questioning. They asked him to walk them through the night again, every word, every movement. He told them everything just as it happened. When they asked how he felt during the stop, he paused before answering. "I felt invisible," he said quietly. Like nothing I said mattered. Like I could show them the truth and they still wouldn't see it. Those words stayed with the review board. They knew this was bigger than just one stop. It was about trust. The kind of trust people were supposed to have in those who wear the badge. The more they looked into the officer's history, the worse it got. Complaints had been filed against them before. Small things, ignored things, rude behavior, unnecessary stops, disrespectful language. Nothing had been done. Until now, both officers were suspended without pay while the department considered further action. Some of their colleagues felt sympathy for them, saying they had made a mistake. But others knew it wasn't just a mistake, but it was a pattern. A way of seeing certain people as less worthy of respect. For Daniel, the punishment didn't bring satisfaction. He didn't feel joy or revenge. Instead, he felt something deeper, a kind of relief mixed with sadness. Relief that the truth had come out, and sadness that it even had to happen in the first place. He wished that night had gone differently. He wished they had seen him for who he really was. Not just an agent, but a person. One evening, after the report was finalized, Daniel sat alone in his apartment. The city lights flickered outside his window. He thought about how close things had come to turning ugly that night. A single misunderstanding could have changed everything. The thought made him shiver. But he also thought about how he had handled himself, calmly, respectfully, with patience. That gave him some comfort. A few days later, his supervisor at the bureau called him into the office. "We read your statement," the supervisor said. "I just want you to know we're proud of how you conducted yourself. You represented the bureau and yourself and with honor." Daniel nodded, but he didn't smile. "Thank you, sir," he said softly. "But I wish I hadn't had to prove that." The supervisor looked at him for a moment, understanding the weight behind those words. "I know," he said quietly. "But sometimes the hardest fights aren't the ones in the field. They're the ones we face in our own communities." That conversation stuck with Daniel. It reminded him that justice wasn't just about catching criminals or solving cases. It was also about standing up for fairness, for respect, for basic human decency. Not long after, a few reporters caught wind of the story. They wanted to interview him, but Daniel declined. He didn't want headlines or interviews. He wanted real change and not attention. Still, the department's decision to discipline the officers became public record and people began to talk. The story sparked discussions about bias and behavior in law enforcement. Some people defended the officers, saying they didn't know. Others pointed out that not knowing wasn't an excuse. Daniel stayed out of the public debate. Instead, he focused on his work. But something inside him had changed. He couldn't just move on as if nothing happened. He wanted to make a difference beyond the paperwork. So, he began volunteering for law enforcement workshops, programs designed to teach awareness, communication and empathy between officers and the communities they served. He never told anyone at first that he was that agent from the story. He simply showed up, listened, and shared experiences from the field. He talked about the importance of respect, not as a rule, but as a way of life. Slowly, word spread about the quiet FBI agent who spoke with honesty, without anger, but with conviction. Meanwhile, the two officers who had stopped him were facing disciplinary hearings. They tried to defend their actions, saying they felt threatened, but their excuses fell flat. The footage and testimony spoke louder than their words. Eventually, one of them resigned quietly, while the other was transferred to desk duty. When Daniel heard the outcome, he didn't celebrate. He simply sighed and whispered to himself, maybe that's a start. He knew real change didn't happen overnight. It took time, conversations, and people willing to look at themselves honestly. He hoped those officers would learn something from the experience, not just about rules or procedures, but about humanity. In the end, Daniel wasn't driven by bitterness. He was driven by purpose. He wanted the next young man pulled over for no reason to have a different experience, one where he'd be treated fairly, one where his voice would be heard. That hope kept him going. Every time he put on his badge after that, it felt a little heavier. Not because he doubted his duty, but because he now carried something more, a reminder that justice isn't just a word on paper. It's something you have to live, even when it's uncomfortable. That night could have broken him, but instead it gave him clarity. He had seen the worst and still believed in the best. That belief, quiet but unshakable, was what made Daniel who he was. And though the case was closed, his story wasn't over. Because deep down he knew this wasn't just about him. It was about every person who had ever been judged unfairly, and every officer who still had the power to choose differently the next time.